Well guys, the Resident Evil Retrospective was fun and all, but I think I need to take a break. Yeah, it's about time we finally move on, and nothing says moving on like covering a series in the same genre, made by the same people and on the same damn system as RE. Well, alright, I never said I wasn't a one-trick pony, but believe me when I say the Dino Crisis series may be comparable to its big brother, but as a whole, might be even more of a mixed-up mess of nonsense. What's up guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to the Dino Crisis Retrospective. The first Dino Crisis, oddly enough, came about as an attempt for Shinji Mikami to make a game that was like Resident Evil but, and I swear this is true, more realistic. Citing obvious influences like Jurassic Park, the RE godfather wanted a game that delivered a different type of horror than his earlier work. Mikami wanted this new feel to be known as panic horror and described the difference between RE and DC as the difference between a funhouse and a roller coaster. Now, whether or not this is the case isn't really the point here. What really mattered at the time was that survival horror fans got another game to sink their teeth into, and believe it or not, the obvious shadow cast by Capcom's other horror franchise led to some legitimately innovative gameplay. Throughout this recent playthrough, it was clear to me that Mikami took a lot of steps to differentiate DC from Resident Evil, and those areas are what really makes the game stick out for me. Where other developers would have fully embraced their lineage when making an RE clone, this team's attempt at setting Dino Crisis apart makes for a lot of gameplay features that really shook up the established rules. While a part of me would have rathered Mikami take such an approach to a new Resident Evil game at the time, the rest of me can't deny how cool this title turned out. Our dino dodging story starts out with a pre-mission debrief style exposition dump letting us know that our little rescue squad, who may or may not employ special tactics, is on a mission to reacquire a certain Dr. Edward Kirk, a scientist who was thought to have died in a bogus lab accident. Seems like the good doctor's been hard at work developing a new unlimited energy source. Now, of course, every good thing has some kind of negative side effect, but in this case it really wasn't so bad. Just a little electromagnetic interference, some difficulties containing it, and oh, that's right, yeah, and it brought back the dinosaurs. All of this, of course, goes unnoticed by the US government, and our team essentially gets dropped into the most nightmarish scenario imaginable. After getting airdropped in, we're introduced to our squad mates and their incredibly conflicting personalities, along with the fact that the compound may be a little less populated than they first expected. Some exploration later, we end up finding out more about the Third Energy experiments and the fact that Dr. Kirk has indeed survived this ordeal. After a failed evac, it's your typical let's get the hell out of here type of plot, which I assume most people would have probably seen coming. Aside from the story itself, I got a kick out of the clashing nature of our three main characters' personalities. They seem to rarely agree on anything, which has me wondering why the US government would send an elite troop of agents into such a dangerous situation without establishing some kind of chain of command. But the good news is Capcom made a mechanic out of this. Throughout the game, Regina will take part in a few disagreements between Gale and Rick, and this means choosing who to side with. Going with one versus the other will lead you down different gameplay paths and trigger different events. This was a nice way to add a bit of replay value and helps differentiate it from the obvious comparisons to RE, and trust me, we will definitely cover that aspect of the game's existence later on. I couldn't really tell you why, but this story actually sticks out a good deal for me. I always appreciate a bit of science fiction nonsense, and the dinosaurs make for a really effective threat. From start to finish, this feels like a one-off type of tale that doesn't really leave much room for more games, and at the time I first played it, I really liked that. It reminded me of my first experience with RE1. I had always thought that I would still have been totally satisfied with its story even if they never followed it up with more characters and information. I think game devs could learn a lot from early game design focusing more on telling a complete story than setting up a future sequel, but we all know this wasn't a one-off tale. Dino Crisis would continue its relative success with a few sequels, but I feel like this is probably the most satisfying story of the bunch. Maybe it's Regina's character, the isolating atmosphere, the change of pace from your typical survival horror game, or a combination of all those elements, but I would totally recommend this story to anyone who likes a little government ops mixed in with their pseudoscience dinosaur story. And honestly, who doesn't like that? Now this is where the action is, both literally and metaphorically. It's no secret to anyone that this game occupied an odd space as a kind of officially licensed RE clone. Not only was the godfather of Resident Evil behind its creation, but even a quick glance at its gameplay will reveal its inspiration, and I think this is where most of DC's appeal comes from. Right from the start, it's very clear that RE fans are in for a familiar time, and it's not so much that the game subverts that expectation, but goes along with it. Dino Crisis follows the survival horror blueprints so faithfully that it really highlights the many times it deviates from them. These additions and alterations feel so new and experimental given the context, and I think that this makes for a really awesome time, but we should probably cover the basics before we get too far off track. Dino Crisis plays exactly like RE, except for when it doesn't. Tank controls, fixed camera positions, inventory management, and the obligatory punishing combat are all present and accounted for, but each one has been tweaked just a bit, which makes them feel just as familiar as they are foreign. The biggest change will likely be incredibly obvious by now. Instead of sticking with the genre's standard pre-rendered environments, DC opts for a fully 3D world. The camera follows the player on a set track, which leaves a bit of wiggle room in the "are these fixed camera angles" argument, and reminds me of how much I love seeing this exact system in Code Veronica on the Dreamcast. Just like RE, you won't be mowing down legions of enemies, but instead dealing with the volatile combination of a few deadly dinos and enough ammo to maybe deal with a quarter of them. In fact, I would argue this game is even more of a survival horror game than Resident Evil in that sense. Your enemies pack a dead serious punch and take more lead to drop than your typical zombie, and more importantly, Dino Crisis never gets to a point where you feel overpowered. In any RE game, it's typically not long till you have a huge cache of weapons and a dwindling amount of enemies to use them on. For me, Dino Crisis never reaches this point. I was always on the razor-thin border between completely out of offensive options and just barely hanging on to my last 3 shotgun shells. Oh, and since we're talking difficulty changes, don't go getting any funny ideas about checking your condition on the inventory screen because this game has no such thing. To get a gauge of how well Regina's doing, you'll need to keep an eye on her run speed and animations. This is a pretty small change from what I expected, but it sends a very big message. Hey survival horror fans, I think it's time to separate the men from the boys. In this same vein, DC adds a whole new damage type to the mix. As you might expect, a Dino Bite has a chance at inflicting the bleed status, and when Regina's bleeding, she's slowly losing health. And some of you guys might be thinking to yourself, hey, isn't that just the poison status from RE? Well, I mean, yeah, it is, but I think it makes a bit more sense here. Plus, the terror of having no clear readout to rely on keeps you searching for hemostat items just in case. The combat here plays out as expected, with no real change to controls, feel, or strategy, except for one major concept. Since Dino Crisis sees fit to give you even less ammunition than any self-respecting RE game, it throws you a bone in the form of the game's traps. The most common enemy in the game can take a whole lot of hits, and they don't exactly let a little gunshot get in between them and a meal. So strewn about the environments are steam vents and laser barriers that can be used to keep these lizards at bay. An amateur will use these as a shield, earning them a free kill without the stress of taking any damage, but it's way more satisfying to leave these bastards alive and then bait them in for an attack, locking them in one spot. There are a few parts in the game where most of the threats can be walled off and dealt with on a per situation basis, which really adds to the strategy here. Sure, it's possible to take out a good number of the dinosaurs you come across, but a true survival horror fan would have a heart attack at the simple idea of just dipping into their precious resources. Making a complex mental map of danger zones and possible bypasses is insanely gratifying and makes for a nice option if you've ascended to the skilled world of survival horror speedruns. Puzzles have also made a triumphant return, but instead of your normal key hunting, you'll be completing some pretty complex tasks to open doors. Not only do most doors require 2 separate types of keys, but they combine to form a puzzle that needs to be solved. Sure, these word jumbles can be fairly easy at first, but later on, they'll have you stumped more often than not. Then there are times you'll need to collect fingerprints from corpses scattered around the area and use clues to identify them in order to use their security clearance. This is a nice change from the statue pushing and key hunting found in RE1, and I guess that's going to be the main focus here. As what is essentially an RE clone, how does Dino Crisis hold up? In my humble opinion, just enough knobs were tweaked here to make this a really unique experience. Of course, Mikami knew he wouldn't be able to escape the comparisons, so he made sure anyone playing DC would constantly have their expectations challenged. The combat is even more challenging than RE's baseline, and the puzzles feel like someone trying to breathe new life into an established trend. Long story short, RE fans will definitely get a kick out of Dino Crisis, but not for the reasons you might think. Instead of slipping into a cozy, familiar experience, I imagine most of the time will be spent appreciating how different it feels. As for non-survival horror fans, I feel like the limited resources and dead serious combat difficulty might turn more than a few away, but if you stick with it, DC is rewarding as hell and without a doubt worth struggling through. The survival horror genre is known for a few key gameplay elements and, depending on who you ask, a certain look. Pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles were responsible for giving this genre its iconic look and feel back when the first few RE games hit the PS1. So imagine my surprise when Dino Crisis' first few screens include a fully 3D environment and a camera that follows the character down certain routes. I kinda think these changes were implemented for two main reasons. Firstly, Mikami must have wanted this game to stand out from his previous work, but more importantly, at this point, developers were comfortable working within the PS1's architecture. Capcom not only had a staff full of people who were familiar with the platform, but also 3D game development. We were now fully committed to the age of fully 3D game worlds, and Mikami struck just the right chord between providing a visually familiar experience and moving the survival horror genre into the future, at least if you ask me. Moving around this island research facility can be incredible looking, as the impressive 3D design of it combines with a camera that sweeps and zooms in a very cinematic way. The 3D nature of your surroundings are also the source of some very cool technical accomplishments. For example, typically a developer will have to choose between great-looking 3D environments and detailed player characters, as the PS1 was pretty limited in what it could handle, but Capcom worked some serious wizardry here. Thanks to the nighttime setting and barren surroundings, it was easy for the devs to render a very small amount of real estate, giving both Regina and her reptilian enemies a lot of polygons to work with. Your main character has an impressive assortment of animations, and above everything else, having her take advantage of the ability to aim and move at the same time will have her walking around with her gun at the high ready, which looks cool as all hell. The inventory screen will look familiar to RE fans, but I gotta say the layout and organization of it is kind of shitty. It never felt easy to get to the item I wanted, and no matter how long I played the game, it never became second nature to navigate it. And with all the easy stuff out of the way, we get to jump into the more technical aspects of the game's presentation. What you're looking at right now is Dino Crisis running on a PS2 using Component Out to provide my FrameMeister with a clean 240p analog signal for upscaling to 1080p digital. And if I do say so myself, it is an impressively sharp result, but there's a really big issue here. As some of you guys may know, the FrameMeister has a hard time switching between internal resolutions on the fly. Games like Silent Hill, Chrono Cross, and Dino Crisis use a high-res 480i mode for their inventory screens, and this means switching between modes can cause some pretty long black screens while the hardware tries to catch up. If you ask me, a game that requires you to open the inventory as much as Dino Crisis is approaching unplayable territory thanks to this little issue, but there is some very good news here. Your garden variety PS3 is able to play any PS1 game and output an incredibly clean 1080p image. The only three downsides being this is technically software emulation.
That's disgusting.
The use of a non-integer scale to fill the screen, and of course the PS3's content protection making life difficult for people trying to capture the HDMI output. I will say the 3D nature of Dino Crisis means shimmering caused by uneven pixel sizing is a non-issue, and really only the snobbiest of video snobs will be able to tell the difference. Playing on the PS3 has no downsides that I could find, as the controls remained responsive, and you just can't argue with such a cheap alternative to the expensive world of PS1 upscaling. Which brings us to the other way to experience some dino-based survival horror. About a year after DC hit the PS1, a Dreamcast and PC port was thrown into the market, and for some pretty specific reasons we'll only be looking at one. Thanks to the Dreamcast running an optimized version of Windows CE and the use of DirectX, PC ports like Dino Crisis and RE2 run almost exactly the same on Sega's white little console, right up to the max output of 640 by 480. And on a bit of a personal note, I'm still experiencing PTSD from getting RE1's PC port up and running on a modern OS. And with that out of the way, I will say there are some downsides to playing DC on the DC. Obviously, 3D assets look amazing here thanks to the 2x scale and increase in horsepower, but some 2D elements did not get so lucky. Most text in the game seems to have been resized with some type of bilinear filter, making for a really blurry look. Now, I know that doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but trust me, it's very noticeable. Of course, this may be a just me type of deal. Aside from the poor scaling of text, everything else is present and accounted for. DC plays just as well here as on its native platform, and there are a few bonuses to be had. First off is the quick turn function being mapped to down and run, just like I'm used to. In the PS1 version, this is mapped to R2, and for some reason, that just never clicked with me. I kept finding myself trying to quick turn with down plus run, and then hitting R2 afterwards. Not really sure why it took new console hardware to make this change, but I'm happy for its inclusion. On top of that, there's the always cool VMU implementation that gives this version a leg up on the PS1. In the original, you could only tell your health level by keeping an eye out for certain behaviors, and ammo of course had to be checked in the inventory screen. But both of these stats are tracked right there on the VMU screen, which makes for another reason that I really wish these things would have become the industry standard. Aside from the interesting nature of its ports, Dino Crisis makes for an incredibly impressive looking game regardless of what console you play it on. It would have been easy for Mikami and his team to just rely on the already perfected mold used to make Resident Evil games, but I really appreciate him wanting to push the envelope even further. Much like the gameplay, Dino Crisis is very similar to its survival horror forefathers, but it's the differences that'll have your attention most of the time, and I think this is a methodology I'd like to see returned to the genre, by any means necessary. Well guys, we have officially kicked off this retrospective. I hope you all had fun with me here because it was an absolute blast coming back to this series after all the time I had spent away. It really is nice being able to experience survival horror in a new and interesting way, and I hope this means these videos will be equally new and interesting for you guys. But I do have to get back to work on the next one, so until then, I can't wait to see all of you again right here on the Dino Crisis Retrospective. Hey guys, thanks for hanging out. If you like survival horror series like this, I have my Parasite Eve and Resident Evil retrospectives right here on screen, and I want to take this time to thank all of my incredible patrons. You guys kick ass on a scale that can't be measured by humans. If you find yourself wanting to support this project, feel free to check out my Patreon page, or hell, just share this video around. Either way, thank you all, and I will see all of you next time.